Aye. Little Chuck Berry.
Run, run, Rudolph, Randolph ain't too far
I like
behind.
this thing over down.
Run, run, Rudolph, Santa's gotta make it to town.
So, that was my festive intro.
Santa make him hurry, tell him
This is, we don't take ourselves, don't ever accuse us of taking ourselves too seriously in the bathtub. I tried to get a little festive outfit today because we're going to do another Christmas edition of the bathtub. And I'm going to take this off. I just wanted everyone to see it real briefly. I have to take it off because my whole face gets so hot from these things. I turn into a big red balloon. Okay, so we're going to have a brief one. This is kind of a follow-up to our Christmas in the bathtub, special Christmas edition of the bathtub last week. And just wanted to come up with a few ideas for you to send to your fellow bathers or people who spend a lot of time in the bathtub over Christmas, or it might be you who spends a lot of time in the bathtub over Christmas. It's a great place to be when it gets cold. And even in California, we get a little chilly out here, so we can use some things. So I mentioned this the past few weeks several times that I kind of found an interest in kind of classic horror fiction, which I never enjoyed in the past. And one of the great things at Christmas many people like are ghost stories. And it's because it gets cold, it's dark out. And the Christmas, in England particularly, the ghost story was always a Christmas tradition. It wasn't just a Christmas carol. There's lots of Christmas stories and Christmas horror stories. And M.R. James, I've never been able to read M.R. James until recently when I've had this newfound interest in kind of, weird tales or horror fiction. This is called Count Magnus and Other Ghost Stories. And I read that this past couple weeks in the bathtub. And he's one of the famous modern ghost story writers who never quite interested me in the past. But because of, coming in through Aikman and Ligotti stuff, I've started going back to some of these writers. And I quite enjoyed all these stories. And this is it's kind of a perfect little Christmas bathtub reading, and it might be fun for a good gift to people. And it's a really nice addition. Now, this is kind of most of his stories were collected in two collections, Ghost Stories of an Antiquary and More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. And I think this is most of his best stories or his most famous stories. And he wrote the stories every Christmas. So he was at Cambridge. Where was he? Yeah. And he came from Kent. And he was at Cambridge. And every Christmas he'd write these stories for friends and he would read them out loud and so forth. And they're often academics in the middle of the ghost story. And he does some funny things with the frame of the story. So he'll often have academics going through old papers and recovering the stories. And the stories are coming through artifacts that they're examining. And it's kind of a nice little gimmick because you never see the total story. You're always getting fragments of the story, which is perfect for a ghost story. I enjoy this a lot. And it kind of connects me to a lot of books I've read in the past few years, which is this really great series of penguins. Now, some of them were in a deliberate series, which were published to connections with Guillermo del Toro. He's the guy that did a movie called Color of Water, which I couldn't stand. But he did the Hellboy movies, and he's done some really good films and really. Kronos, his first movie, is really good, and he's got a beautiful eye and kind of weird imagination. And he did a series of kind of horror, weird story tales with Penguin, and one of the editors is a guy named I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. I shouldn't. S.T. Joshi or S.T. Yoshi. I don't know. And I should look that up, but I'm sorry, we're terrible at the bathtub. And he does really excellent editions. I've become a fan of this editor. I don't normally get fans of editors, but he does a really nice editions. There's some terrific annotations. The annotations are not in your face, so there's almost no footnotes. I hate footnotes when I'm reading a book in the bathtub. And yet, if you want to kind of go in and get a little more information, they're laid out in a really nice and fairly substantial appendix at the end of the M.R. James book. And they did an edition of Poe, which doesn't have as many annotations, but there's quite a few books that are in and out of this series. I think I mentioned last week, I've always thought Lovecraft was a joke, but I thought Clark Ashton Smith was a joke. Hold on, I gotta get this down here because I have to do a mea culpa. Anyway, this is what kind of got me into some of this stuff. This is a kind of great undiscovered California writer. We did an episode a few months ago on him. And Clark Ashton Smith was brilliant at what he did. And he and Lovecraft were old buddies. And they wrote this really florid, over-the-top style, which when I was younger I thought was ludicrous, which now I find really quite fun. They're really kind of interesting writers, and they're not ridiculous as I used to think. They're quite sensible and controlled, and they know what they're doing. So anyway, those are two. Also, these are both by Joshi again, the editor. So I know I'm going to have to make an apology about the pronunciation, Joshi, I think. And both of these are great. These are really good editions. The Penguin Classics there was a series that was done. The series with Guillermo del Toro did a lot of really interesting books about over the past 5 or 10 years. Charles Beaumont, one of the great unknown short story writers and screenwriters. He did a lot of stuff with Corman. Almost everything this guy did was a great narrative story. And if he had lived, he would have been as famous as Ray Bradbury. Last year, I reviewed another book in the series, which is The Best of Richard Matheson. Great Christmas Bathtub. Okay, Richard Matheson wrote I Am Legend, which was turned into all these vampire movies. And he wrote tons of really, really good stories. And he and Beaumont both did numbers of the Twilight Zones, the old black and white Twilight Zones. Most of the best scripts were by these guys. So most of the ones you remember are by those. And these are not edited by Joshi, but they're really nice editions of stories that aren't really in print anywhere else. Here's Joshi again with two more. I haven't read these. I've never really read Macon or Algernon Blackwood, but now I'm kind of interested. I may read them over Christmas. You may want to think about them. I have read some Lord Dunsany. This is another Joshi edition. You know, the guy gets around. And again, they're almost always characterized by they're well selected. The Penguin editions are quite lovely. Penguin really should come. I've been writing Penguin, telling them to do more of these things. These are really nice editions, and they're taking kind of popular fiction or kind of odd, weird fiction from the past 100 years, and they're putting them in a nice, substantial copy that you enjoy. This is another one, American Supernatural Tales. I just got this because I'm buying all of these now. I'm really enjoying them, and that has kind of supernatural tales going back to the major important writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who really is American Supernatural, one of the really interesting, strange American writers, and Poe, and then taking you all up through people like Joyce Carol Oates and Thomas Ligotti, who we've talked about, and they're all in here. So I really, again, I'm just buying these up as I find them, and I really recommend these. This is kind of a fun Christmas gift for anybody. You can get one of these copies, a copy of one of these books for friends or for yourself. Here's 2 or 3 things. Last Christmas I read, the Pullman books. We've talked about that. The Pullman books, I'm getting those. Hold on a second, I'll find them. Most of you know who the Pullman books are. I'm not telling you these big secrets, but the most famous, his first this trilogy of his, the Her Dark Materials trilogy. This is an old paperback edition. And that's a great trilogy to give to almost any age, I would say, or read it yourself if you haven't read the Her Dark Materials. It's a nice fantasy trilogy for the Christmas weeks. And it's a sequelish to the Her Dark Materials. I read it last Christmas, and I think the gimmick is, I recall this book takes place after Her Dark Materials. I can't remember now. To be honest, I completely forgot the book. But and then another one's going to be after, or one's before. Anyway, it's an interesting structural way, and it's well written. Pullman's a really good writer, and I got to say, halfway through it, I got bored. It turned into a chase narrative. I hate chase narratives, so I may have been wrong, but you might enjoy that. Here's a book as far as kind of supernatural. One of my favorite books is The Changing Light at Sandover by James Merrill, one of my favorite poets. This is an amazing book. And this is a great book for yourself or to give to somebody at Christmas. And it's an epic poem with a Ouija board. And I don't want to say much more than that, except that it's a completely crackpot idea. The first book, the first fourth of it, is beautiful poetry. Merrill was an amazing poet. And then it goes off into some people don't like the second half of the book, which I can understand. It gets a little crazy, and it really goes into the Ouija board. more and more. But it's really about these guys kind of contacting all sorts of strange stuff which they may or may not believe in, but they go off into sort of a theosophical rant with poetry and explore the history of the universe, history of mankind, or whatever. It's a wonderful book, and I would really recommend it. One last book, I'm getting these off the shelves, is I read this 2 years ago for some conference I had to go to, and I didn't think I would like it. But since we talked about these various horror writers, and again, sometimes weird tales writers, this is called The Night Ocean by Paul Lafarge. It's a really, I didn't think I would like it, and it's a little too complicated for my taste. It has a lot of meta-narrative stories being told by people telling stories and fragmentary stories. But the central story is about H.P. Lovecraft as a character, who is a real character, a really interesting person, I think, from what I've read from the biographies. One of which was written by S.T. Joshi. The guy he obviously does not sleep. And it has to do with Lovecraft, and then a lot of these kind of odd characters from cultural history, like Donald A. Wollheim, who used to be a big science fiction editor and one of the first fans, who I met years and years ago when I was a kid, and who was Frederick Pohl and the Futurians, and it's just a kind of really interesting book that if you really don't have to be interested in those characters. It's about a writer, and it's a strange, haunting book. I enjoyed reading it. So there's a number of ideas. It's a real grab bag of stuff, but I think you probably have a good time in the bathtub with almost any one of those books. Okay, and you might pass them on to somebody as a Christmas gift. I know I give some of these. I give people all the time at Christmas. All right, so I guess what am I going to try to do here? I think I'm going to try this. I'm going to send us out with another little rockin' Christmas song, and I promise not to sing. I think that'll be the last Christmas one. So have a good Christmas, and we'll be back soon with something less Christmassy. Okay. Happy Christmas. Bye. I gotta go.